When Americans think of Muslims, they might identify with the Nation of Islam.
You wanted some action then, didn't you? Because you don't like the idea of white people shooting black people down, do you?
Or media portrayals of Arabs as terrorists and extremists. But what many do not know is the fascinating history of Muslims in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, there were stories of those who came from Africa and practiced their religion long before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. Ancient manuscripts from West African Muslim scholars give clear testimony of voyages to the West and the arrival of America's first Muslim settlement. In the time that followed, a chain of events would unfold that would forever change the world's religious landscape. For 7 centuries, countless African, Asian, and Middle Eastern Muslims would arrive in America, some by force, others by choice. Over the years, their evolution would become legendary, the impact of which has already been felt around the world. Now, as we enter the 8th century of America's relationship with Muslims, things have never been more complicated. Conflicts in Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the 9/11 attacks on New York have created a great divide among many Americans. Attitudes from the past have begun to resurface. But times have changed. Today, there are nearly 10 million Muslims living in America. Prepare yourself for a journey that will examine this history and the people who dared to live out this great American story of 8 centuries of Muslims in America. Islam came to Africa during the 7th century, and its initial spread was part of the single most cultural change in the history of the world. The word that an Ethiopian sat at the side of the prophet of the new religion traveled fast. Bilal ibn Rabah became a familiar revolutionary figure and the most celebrated African in Islamic history. When the Muslims entered Mecca in triumph in 630 AD, Bilal made the first call to prayer from atop the new mosque. As caravans of Arab merchants crossed the Sahara to trade during the first Islamic centuries, they brought stories of Bilal's devotion to the faith and of other African Muslims who were active in the movement. Centers of commerce paved the way for the new religion and provided the first places of worship as traders began to have prayer areas in the towns. Islam was accepted as early as 850 AD in the Senegal, Ghana, and Mali region, which became the starting point for Arab and West African relations under the banner of Islam. Arab historians began to write about West Africa, a place they referred to as Bilad al-Tikur, land of the black Muslims. Abdullah al-Bakri, a Muslim geographer, gives an early account of Islam in West Africa during the 11th century. In his book of Roads and Kingdoms, he said it was a prosperous area, and the Muslim ministers were learned enough to record events in Arabic and corresponded with other Islamic states. Beyond religion, Islam brought a common language and writing systems that were molded into formal education institutions. The works of Muslim scholars were preserved for many centuries by written manuscripts. Some of these scholars had made tremendous strides in laying many of the foundations for modern science. One school that prospered while collecting these manuscripts of knowledge was in the West African city of Timbuktu. Built as a mosque in 989 AD, Sankore University became the African continent's greatest center of learning and perhaps the finest university in the world during the 14th through 16th centuries. The massive number of documents rivaled those anywhere in the world. Books from social scientists like Ibn Khaldun and mapmakers like Muhammad Ali Idrisi were considered as valuable as gold. Scholars were held in the highest esteem, and students numbered in the tens of thousands.
That's when Islam went into a golden age. Scholars and students came from all over the Muslim world into Black Africa. A point of reference is the case of Abdul Rahman al-Tamimi, who was from the family of the Prophet. He was from the Sharif family of Mecca. And there were so many Sudanese students coming into Mecca to study there, and he fell in love with these here Africans. So he said, listen, I'm going to go to Timbuktu to help these brothers out. When he arrived in Timbuktu in the 13th century, he thought he was going to teach. He went into the Sankore University, and in that university was a black scholar by the name of Modibo Muhammad Kaburi. When he sat in the scholarship, he saw not only was he not qualified to teach in this university, he was not even qualified as a student. So he left Timbuktu and went back to the Karawane, North Africa, and studied for 12 years, and he came back and became Modibo Muhammad Kaburi's chief student, and he then inherited the deanship of that university after Modibo Muhammad Kaburi.
In 1324, the ruler of Mali, Mansa Musa, was en route to Mecca in Arabia when he informed the governor of Cairo, Egypt, that his predecessor had taken a voyage across the Atlantic. The story was confirmed when Shihab ad-Din al-Umari, a 14th century Egyptian geographer, reported the astonishing story of Abu Bakr II, Mali's voyager king, who set sail in 1310 for the North Equatorial Current, which from the west coast of Africa would lead straight to the Americas. Bakr had heard tales of an ancient African civilization across the Atlantic Ocean. Portuguese Muslims had brought back word of its existence from a voyage some 50 years earlier. They told of giant African heads of stone, whose history would later be traced back 1,500 years before the birth of Jesus.
There are elements of sculpture, as you know, in Mexico, which has so-called Negroid features, and we know the sculpture goes back 2,000 years. So obviously that sculpture must have had models long before Christopher Columbus.
Malian scribes and griots tell of two separate voyages. During the first, Abu Bakr sent a fleet of ships to explore the new land. They landed in the Gulf of Mexico, then sailed up what they called the Big River, which we assume was the Mississippi. The captain of his fleet returned to Timbuktu with invaluable charts of the voyage and what they had seen. King Abu Bakr soon assembled hundreds of vessels with trade goods and supplies for the new settlements, then set out on the second voyage across the Atlantic. Some settled in Brazil, Honduras, and along the Mexico coast near the Aztec civilization.
All the Muslims came to America even before Columbus. Muslims came to America in 13th century. So Muslims came to America even before Columbus came here. And some of the navigators with Columbus in his ship, they were also Muslims.
I've written about it with regard to UNESCO General History of Africa, that people from what was then the Mali Empire took off in order to cross the Atlantic. In Volume 8 of the UNESCO General History of Africa, of which I was editor, and one of the chapters included that discussion whether there were black sailors who crossed the Atlantic before Columbus.
Mansa Musa is mostly remembered for his extravagant Hajj to Mecca with 100 camel loads of gold. But during his pilgrimage, he brought back the components for an extensive Arabic library, religious scholars, and most importantly, the Muslim architect al-Sahili, who was to build the great mosque at Gao in Timbuktu. The Hajj and stories of Mandinkan explorations planted Mali in people's minds, and on this map, Mansa was shown as a richly attired monarch holding a large gold nugget in the area south of the Sahara. With Musa being a strong supporter of education, Sankore University began its collection of manuscripts and navigational charts, which would become vital to the 15th century seamen. Muslim navigators were in demand, and as many as 3 went to sea with Christopher Columbus. They provided a means of communication and ocean charts for his journey. A renowned American historian, Leo Weiner of Harvard University, wrote that Columbus was well aware of the Mandinka presence in the New World, and that the West African Muslims had spread throughout the Western Hemisphere. Columbus admitted in his papers that while his ship was sailing near Jabara on the northeast coast of Cuba, he saw a mosque on the top of a beautiful mountain. He told his son of a tribe of Muslim natives known as Al-Mami. In Mandinka and Arabic languages, Al-Mami was the designation of Al-Imam, the person who leads the prayer. There is extensive evidence that supports the idea of African Muslim contact with early Native Americans. They spread their language and exchanged products, leaving evidence of their encounters with the people of the New World. Hernando Cortés, the Spanish explorer, described the dress of the native women of the Aztecs as long-veiled, with the same design and cloth worn by the Moorish women of Granada. He wrote of handkerchiefs, headdresses, and loincloths that resembled the cloth that West African Muslims exported into Morocco, Spain, and Portugal. When Europeans began to immigrate to America, they found African tribes living on the land. Many of them had ties to the Moors, Mandinkans, and the Olmecs. The century which followed saw the breakdown of Timbuktu, when ships displaced caravans and slavers began to pillage the city. This practice of enslaving educated Muslims grew to gigantic proportions as students and scholars were taken from their mosques and homes by Portuguese and Moroccan slavers. From 1442 to 1700, millions of men, women, and children were kidnapped by European and Arab slavers, with many thought to be practicing Muslims. A striking example of Islamic presence in America during the 17th and 18th century are letters and documents which were written by Africans who were literate in Arabic. There are many stories of Muslims in early America, such as Yaro Mahmoud, who came from West Africa in the mid-1700s as a slave and died a free practicing Muslim at 128 years old. But for the most part, Islamic influences had a hard time surviving the slavery period. Africans that were brought to America were prohibited from speaking their native languages, which included Arabic. This had the effect of eliminating a common thread of communication shared by many of the slaves.
The slaves who were brought to America, most of them, 2/3 of them were Muslims. And they were even exchanging letters between them in Arabic. We call that Ajami. Ajami is using the Arabic letters to write letters. So that was in existence in Africa before the slavery.
The United States of America's shaky relationship with Muslims began during the very first days of the nation. American conflicts with Muslim states in North Africa provided the U.S. Marine Corps a theme song. The line from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli was in response to events surrounding a war at the start of the 19th century in Africa. Although the country was at war with Muslims abroad, the seed of Islam had been planted at home. There are two well-known American Muslim communities that arose during the early 19th century. In the state of Georgia, Bilali Muhammad, also known as Ben Ali, was the leader of a congregation. In 1829, he wrote a 13-page Arabic textbook regarding the laws of Islam and Islamic living. From 1816 to 1840, Salih Bilali was the trusted head slave manager of more than 450 Africans, many of them Muslims. It was reported by his owner's son that while Salih was on his deathbed, his last words were, "Allah is God and Muhammad is his prophet." Unlike other African Muslims, both were able to practice their faith freely. Scholars have cited that Brazil received more enslaved Muslims than anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere. It was reported that 200,000 Muslims lived along the Amazon River and on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. They were traced back to the Abu Bakr settlements through an Arabic codex, which included a copy of a handwritten Quran in the Mali style of Arabic dated sometime in the 14th century. During this time, the search for a better life brought a more serious Muslim to America. This marked the return of Quranic terms and practices that would re-energize the growth of Islam in the West.
I always tell the story of a Lebanese in 1900 who went to Beirut Harbor and wanted to board a ship bound for New York. When he asked the captain of the ship, "Do they have mosques in America?" The captain said no. He jumped off the boat. I always say that if this Lebanese knew that in less than 90 years, the lifetime of his children, there will be at least 1,500 masajids and Islamic centers in America, he would have come. If that Lebanese was given a vision by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that an American president will come to his neighborhood in Jordan and will be on television in Lebanon and Syria and all those areas there, telling them that in America, in my country, he's a Christian president, in my country, people say the azan 5 times a day. If that Lebanese was given a vision by Allah 90 years ago, he would have come. He didn't come. But other Lebanese came.
During the early 1900s, the first wave of Muslim immigrants came to America. A substantial number found themselves in a strange society with very few links to the Islamic world. Some continued their practice of the religion, while others fit into the American melting pot, but all were conscious of their heritage.
In 1904, my grandfather and grandmother left their native home in Jerusalem and came to Boston, to America. And in doing so, they in fact expanded my heritage. Till that point, if they had not made that migration, I would have been an Arab. But now, because they came here and because my father was born in Boston, I am an Arab American. I just ask you to think about how amazing it is that a president of the United States could have had an Arab American as a chief of staff.
As the language of the Quran was reintroduced to America, it seemed to motivate the return of Islamic thought. Albanian Muslims opened a mosque in Maine and later in Connecticut. In 1929, Muslim farmers had a place of worship at Ross, North Dakota. But what is considered to be the first building in North America to be designed exclusively as a mosque was constructed at Cedar Rapids Falls in Iowa. Built in 1934 by Lebanese immigrants, this community was very tightly knit. Going overseas to marry was common. Arabic was widely used. The financial base was strong, and only a few drifted from the religion. African Americans began to rediscover their heritage around this time. In 1913, Noble Drew Ali established the Moorish Science Temple of America in Newark, New Jersey. Born Timothy Drew in 1886, he traveled to Egypt where he learned the messages of the Circle 7 Quran.
The Noble Drew Ali movement was very important in our evolutionary progress towards understanding the meaning of and having the desire for freedom, justice, and equality. Noble Drew Ali was a very important part of this evolutionary progress.
By 1928, Drew Ali had 15 temples with an active membership of over 100,000. He was the first to teach of Prophet Muhammad in the inner cities. In 1921, Dr. Mufti Muhammad Siddiq from India began to gather converts. He established the first headquarters of the Ahmadiyya Muslims and practiced a form of Islam. It was the only source of Islamic knowledge available to African Americans at that time. In the early 1920s, Duse Muhammad Ali, an Egyptian, and black nationalist Marcus Garvey broadened the concept of Africans in Islam. Ali taught the history of ancient Egypt and expanded the understanding of the Moorish Islamic empires. He was the first to profess the Moors were in America before Columbus in Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World. The movement established an organization in Detroit known as the Universal Islamic Society. In the 1930s, a basic concept of Islam began to find a receptive audience in America's urban centers. One of the greatest proponents among black people was an immigrant silk merchant named Wallace D. Farrard. He was an Orthodox Muslim from the Pakistani region of India who had been educated by the British.
He came to really attract poor, lost blacks who had no hope in their future in this country, didn't believe that this society would ever give us respect. He came and he attracted them to join him so they can have their separate world, their separate nation.
Farrard introduced his new converts to Muslim prayer and proclaimed that the only way African Americans could get out of their condition was to submit to the will of Allah. In a 1933 interview on a radio show in Detroit that included Dr. Albert Einstein, noted scientist and human rights activist, Farrard spoke about awareness and sensitivity.
For years now, people who have attended my lectures have been asking me questions about my theory of religion, truth, Islam, Allah, etc., etc. But you see, Mr. Einstein, 95% of the population have made religion and truth something permanent. And is religion and truth permanent? If it is, then it is continuous. And what is continuous is not truth. That is the beauty of truth. It must be discovered from moment to moment.
Farad had built a strong argument highlighting American Christians' difficulties combating the effects of slavery and racism.
His plan was to attract the most illiterate of them, but to teach them to become educated, to teach them, give them a sense of greatness, divine greatness, so that in time their children will become better educated, and they would then look for help from sources that respected their intellects. And the only material he left back with us that respects our intellect, as it should be respected, is the Holy Book Quran, that he showed great respect for the Holy Book. The only picture they have of him is a picture of him looking piously at the Holy Book like this.
In 1931, a woman in Detroit named Clara Poole heard Farad speak. When she introduced him to her husband Elijah, together they would form an organization that would change the face of America forever.
Master Farad Muhammad gave him 104 books to study. And Elijah Muhammad said to me, the best of those books was the Holy Quran. And the other 103 all contained aspects of the life of Prophet Muhammad.
When Farad disappeared in 1934, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad assumed leadership.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad was a very wise man, and though his teacher conceived the Nation of Islam, even the school, the University of Islam, all of that language, all of that was conceived by Farad Muhammad. But the emphasis on economics was just a hint in the teachings of Farad. The establishment of education was, I would say, a hint in the teachings of Farad, though he had, though he insisted that the members learn to read and write, and their minds be excited, the intellect be excited for education or for higher knowledge. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad was the one who established the Nation of Islam. He took it from little pamphlets and ideas and vagaries, and he had the courage to go out there and try it, and he established business and all that.
Discover today's American Muslim on the Muslim News Magazine television network. This revolutionary new channel offers award-winning films like 8 Centuries of Muslims in America, and documentaries like A Legacy of Education, the history of Clara Muhammad schools. Experience the culture and history of Muslims in America like never before. Muslim News Magazine is available on demand 24 hours a day. Catch exclusive content and original series like Raising Islam in America, available only on M&M TV. See amazing shows free on demand 24 hours a day. M&M is the #1 Islamic channel for today's Muslim American. Subscribe to the Muslim News Magazine television network now.